unjustly condemned to the death chair. Her story is one of divine intervention, faith, and a miraculous transformation. In this video, we'll explore the incredible journey of a woman who, facing her darkest hour, found salvation through her unwavering belief in God. Her final words, spoken moments before the execution, changed everything. This is a story of hope, redemption, and the power of faith. Sarah had always been a pillar of her small community. She was the kind of person everyone turned to in times of need, the kind of soul whose light seemed to shine brighter than the struggles of the world around her. Whether it was delivering meals to the elderly, sitting with grieving families, or organizing church events, Sarah's life was defined by service. She believed that her purpose on earth was to reflect the love of Christ to others. Her days began early with prayer, her voice lifted in thanksgiving to God for another day to make a difference. She worked quietly and tirelessly, leaving behind no trace of complaint, only gratitude. Children adored her, elders respected her, and even those who had no interest in faith admired her gentle but unshakable convictions. But light has a way of attracting darkness, and Sarah's light had caught the attention of a man named Victor, a troubled soul whose greed and desperation had driven him to dangerous places. Victor was deeply indebted to dangerous people, and when a wealthy local businessman was found dead in his office, Victor saw an opportunity to shift the blame. He needed someone the town could believe might have had access to the businessman's property, someone whose absence of motive would ironically make them seem beyond suspicion. Sarah, with her church outreach and routine visits to various businesses for charitable contributions, was the perfect scapegoat. The setup was flawless. A stolen item from the crime scene found its way into Sarah's home. The testimony of an eyewitness claimed to have seen her leaving the businessman's office late at night, though she had been at home reading scripture and praying for hours. She had no idea the web was being spun around her until officers showed up at her door. The arrest shocked the town. People who had once smiled at Sarah in the pews of the local church now whispered behind her back. Some believed in her innocence, but others, swayed by the mounting evidence, began to distance themselves. Her trial was swift and grueling. The prosecution painted a picture of someone who had become embittered by the businessman's refusal to fund one of her church projects. They wove a tale of hidden resentment that led her to commit a crime of passion. Sarah sat silently, her Bible clutched in her lap, as the jury delivered their verdict. Guilty. The judge's words rang in her ears as he sentenced her to death. "May God have mercy on your soul," he intoned, as if already condemning her to hell. As she was led from the courtroom in shackles, Sarah looked up and whispered, "I trust in you, Lord. You are my judge, and you know my heart." In the cold, gray walls of the prison, Sarah began her new reality. The stark contrast between her vibrant life in the community and the suffocating confines of her cell would have broken many. But Sarah's faith remained steadfast. Each day, she turned to God, pouring out her anguish and confusion in prayer. She prayed not for deliverance, but for strength to endure whatever purpose God had in this season of her life. The other inmates were drawn to her. At first, they watched her with skepticism, wary of her calm demeanor and constant murmuring of scripture. But over time, they saw that her faith was not a performance. It was the very core of her being. She began to lead small prayer groups in the yard, teaching her fellow inmates about forgiveness, redemption, and the love of Christ. Hardened criminals broke down in tears as Sarah prayed over them, their hearts softened by the presence of someone so filled with grace. The guards noticed her as well. Some mocked her, calling her the preacher, but others found themselves strangely moved by her peacefulness. One guard, a young man named Ethan, began to visit her cell regularly, asking questions about faith and salvation. Sarah's impact reached beyond the prison walls, as inmates wrote letters to their families, telling them about the woman who had shown them a glimpse of hope in a hopeless place. Still, Sarah was not immune to fear. As the weeks turned into months and her execution date drew closer, the weight of her situation pressed heavily on her spirit. At night, she would weep silently, her tears soaking the thin mattress of her bunk. She thought of her family, her church, and the life she would never return to. But each morning, she rose with renewed resolve, reminding herself that God's plan was greater than her understanding. One day she received a visit from her church pastor, who brought with him a small, dog-eared Bible. He was the first familiar face Sarah had seen in months, and she could barely contain her tears. "I don't understand why this is happening," she admitted, her voice breaking. "But I know God is with me, and I trust Him." Her pastor clasped her hands. "Sarah, your faith is a testimony. You may not see the full picture, but your life is in God's hands. Even here, He is working through you." Sarah held onto those words as the days counted down. Though her circumstances seemed bleak, she believed that her time in the prison was not wasted. She saw every moment as an opportunity to glorify God, to plant seeds of faith in the hearts of those around her. The days leading up to Sarah's execution were filled with a strange, quiet tension. The world around her seemed to move on, indifferent to the gravity of her impending fate. For Sarah, each passing hour felt like both an eternity and a fleeting moment. In her cell, she continued to pray, her knees sore from hours spent on the cold concrete floor. Her prayers were not for escape or reprieve, but for peace. Peace for herself, for those who had wronged her, and for the community that would carry on after she was gone. Sarah's fellow inmates, many of whom had come to admire her deeply, were unusually somber. Those she had prayed with over the months took turns sitting outside her cell, offering her what little comfort they could, a kind word, a shared memory, or just quiet companionship. To these women hardened by years of incarceration, Sarah had become a symbol of grace under fire, a living testament to the power of faith in the darkest circumstances. One inmate, Maria, who had initially scoffed at Sarah's prayers, now knelt beside her every evening, clutching a rosary Sarah had made from threads pulled from her prison blanket. "You've changed me, Sarah," Maria whispered one night. "I don't even know how to thank you." "Thank God," Sarah replied with a gentle smile. "He's the one who changes hearts." Outside the prison walls, a small group of supporters continued to advocate for Sarah's innocence. Her pastor, along with a few members of her congregation, tirelessly petitioned for a retrial, gathering signatures and meeting with lawyers who might be able to help. But the legal system was a formidable and slow-moving machine, and the chances of overturning her conviction before the scheduled execution seemed slim. Sarah, however, asked them to shift their prayers. "Don't pray for my release," she had written in a letter to her pastor. "Pray that God's will is done, whatever that may be. He has already given me peace." The night before her execution, Sarah was visited by the prison chaplain, a kind but weary man named Reverend Morris. He had walked many inmates through their final hours, but Sarah's case weighed heavily on him. Sitting across from her in the small, dimly lit visitation room, he struggled to find the words to comfort her. "How are you feeling, Sarah?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm at peace," she said softly, her hands folded neatly in front of her. "I've given it all to God. Whatever happens tomorrow, I know He is with me." Reverend Morris nodded, though his heart ached for her. "You're remarkable," he said after a long pause. "Your faith, it's unshakable." Sarah smiled faintly. "It's not my faith that's strong. It's God who is strong. I'm just holding on to Him." They prayed together for over an hour, their voices blending in the stillness of the prison. Sarah asked God to bless the prison staff, the warden, the guards, and even the prosecutor who had worked so hard to convict her. She prayed for her family, that they would find comfort in God's presence after she was gone. And finally, she prayed for Victor, the man she suspected had framed her. "Lord, touch his heart," she said. "Bring him to repentance, and let him know your love." When Reverend Morris left, Sarah returned to her cell and spent the night writing letters. One was for her family, assuring them of her love and her belief in her ultimate reunion with them in heaven. Another was for the other inmates, encouraging them to keep seeking God no matter their circumstances. And the last was for Victor, though she doubted he would ever read it. In it, she forgave him and urged him to seek redemption. As dawn broke, Sarah was awakened by the sound of the cell block stirring. Her execution was scheduled for later that day, and the atmosphere in the prison was heavy. The guards who escorted her to the holding area were uncharacteristically quiet, their usual stoicism replaced by a hint of unease. Even those who had mocked her faith seemed reluctant to meet her eyes. In the holding area, Sarah was given a chance to meet with her pastor. One last time, he brought her a small wooden cross, which she held tightly as they prayed together. "This isn't the end," he reminded her, tears in his eyes. "It's just the beginning." "I know," Sarah replied. "I'm ready." The hours leading up to her execution were filled with a strange mix of emotions. Sarah felt an overwhelming sense of calm, as if she were being carried by a force greater than herself. She spent the time in prayer, her lips moving silently as she meditated on scripture. She recited verses from memory, her favorite being Psalm 23. "Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me." As the final moments approached, Sarah was led to the death chamber. The room was stark and clinical, filled with witnesses who had come to watch justice, or what they believed to be justice, unfold. Some were there out of a sense of duty, others out of morbid curiosity. Among them were her pastor and a few members of her congregation who had been granted permission to attend. The warden, a stern man who had seen countless executions, asked Sarah if she had any final words. Sarah took a deep breath, lifting her head high. Her voice, though soft, carried a profound strength. "God is my refuge and my strength," she said, her eyes scanning the room. "I forgive those who condemned me, and I pray that the truth will set them free. Into your hands, Lord, I commit my spirit." The room fell silent, the weight of her words hanging in the air. For a moment, even the most skeptical among the witnesses felt a pang of doubt, a stirring of something they couldn't quite name. As the executioner prepared to activate the switch, Sarah closed her eyes, her lips still moving in silent prayer. The tension in the room was palpable, the seconds stretching into what felt like eternity. And then, just as the order was about to be given, the unexpected happened, something that no one present could have foreseen. The moment Sarah spoke her final words, a stillness enveloped the room, a silence so profound it seemed to press against the walls. Those who had come expecting to witness an execution instead found themselves transfixed, unable to look away from the woman who sat calmly, her faith shining brighter than the fear that typically dominated such a setting. Sarah's words, "Into your hands, Lord, I commit my spirit," lingered in the air like a prayer that refused to dissipate. For the witnesses in the room, it was as though the very atmosphere had shifted. Even the warden, a man hardened by years of overseeing executions, hesitated as if searching for some unseen cue to proceed. Then, without warning, the lights flickered. A faint buzz filled the air, and the room was suddenly plunged into complete darkness. Gasps and murmurs erupted from the witnesses. their voices filled with confusion and unease. Sound of shuffling feet echoed as people shifted in their seats, unsure of what was happening. In the pitch black, Sarah remained silent, her head bowed in prayer. The darkness didn't last long. Within moments, the emergency lights powered on, casting the room in an eerie, dim glow. The once pristine white walls were now bathed in a pale, flickering light that made the scene feel surreal. All eyes turned to the execution chamber, where Sarah sat unmoved, her hands resting gently in her lap. As everyone adjusted to the dim light, the door to the observation room burst open. A prison official rushed in, holding a stack of papers. His face was pale, and his breathing was labored as if he had run a great distance. He approached the warden with urgency, thrusting the papers into his hands. The warden frowned, flipping through the documents. Quickly, his expression hardened, then softened as he read. The tension in the room grew palpable as everyone waited to see what would happen next. "Stop the execution," the warden said, his voice firm but tinged with disbelief. "New evidence has come to light." A collective gasp filled the room. Sarah, hearing the words but unsure of their full meaning, slowly lifted her head. Her eyes met the warden's through the glass, and for the first time, a flicker of hope passed over her face. The prison official stepped forward, addressing the witnesses. "A confession has been received from another individual," he explained, his voice shaking slightly. "The evidence exonerates the condemned. The execution is halted immediately." The room erupted into chaos. Some of the witnesses cheered, while others shouted in disbelief. Reporters who had been present scrambled to take notes, their pens flying across their notepads. The guards, unsure of what to do, exchanged confused glances before moving to unstrap Sarah from the chair. As the restraints were removed, Sarah sat in stunned silence, her mind racing to process what had just happened. She looked up at the warden, who now stood before her with an expression that was equal parts relief and awe. "You're free to go," he said simply, though the words carried an immense weight. "The evidence proves your innocence. I'm sorry for what you've endured." Tears welled in Sarah's eyes, but they were not tears of anger or bitterness. Instead, they were tears of gratitude. Gratitude to God for answering her prayers, gratitude for the chance to continue her mission, and gratitude for the people who had worked tirelessly to uncover the truth. As she was escorted out of the chamber and back into the hallway, Sarah was met with applause from some of the staff and fellow inmates who had gathered to watch the proceedings unfold. Maria, the inmate who had become one of her closest friends, stood near the front of the crowd, her hands clasped together as tears streamed down her face. "You're free," Maria whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "God answered your prayers." Sarah reached out and clasped Maria's hands. "He answers all prayers," she said softly. "Sometimes we just have to wait to see how." Outside the prison gates, Sarah's pastor and members of her congregation were waiting. When they saw her emerge, their faces lit up with joy. They rushed to embrace her, their voices lifting in praises to God for the miracle they had witnessed. News of the event spread rapidly. The story of the innocent woman who had been moments away from death, only to be saved by a last-minute confession, became a sensation. Reporters flocked to interview Sarah, but she remained humble, redirecting all praise to God. "This was his doing, not mine," she told a reporter who asked about her faith. "I was ready to meet him, but he had other plans. I'll spend the rest of my life honoring this second chance." The man who had confessed to the crime, Victor, was arrested and brought to justice. Sarah, true to her nature, requested permission to visit him in prison. When they met, Victor struggled to meet her gaze, shame evident in every line of his face. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't think it would go this far. Sarah reached out and placed a hand on his. I forgive you, she said simply. But more importantly, God forgives you. Seek him, Victor. He's waiting for you. Victor broke down in tears, and though Sarah would never know the full impact of her words, she prayed that they would take root in his heart. For Sarah, the events of that day were a turning point. She dedicated her life to advocating for the wrongly accused, using her story to bring attention to flaws in the justice system. She traveled across the country, speaking in churches, schools, and prisons, sharing the message of God's love and the power of faith. Her story became a testament to the truth of her final words in the chamber. God is my refuge and my strength. Through her faith, her perseverance, and the divine intervention that saved her life, Sarah touched countless lives, proving that even in the darkest moments, God's light can shine through. The days that followed Sarah's miraculous release were a whirlwind of emotions and events. She was no longer just a woman wrongfully accused. She had become a symbol of divine justice and the power of faith. Her story spread far and wide, and letters poured in from people she had never met. Strangers moved by her unwavering belief in God and her extraordinary ability to forgive. But for Sarah, the first moments of freedom were spent in quiet reflection. As she stood outside the prison gates, feeling the warmth of the sun on her face for the first time in years, she whispered a prayer of gratitude. Lord, thank you for this second chance. Let my life now be a testimony of your mercy and love. Her pastor and members of her church surrounded her with tears and hugs, celebrating her freedom. They took her to a small gathering at the church that evening, where Sarah was welcomed back with hymns and prayers. Though her heart was heavy with the memories of her trial and imprisonment, she felt a profound sense of peace. This is what it means to trust God, she told the congregation. Even when the world says it's over, He is still writing the story. The revelation of her innocence ignited a firestorm of public debate about the justice system. Advocacy groups reached out to Sarah, asking her to share her story as a way to highlight the flaws that had nearly cost her life. At first, the idea of stepping into the public eye overwhelmed her. She had always preferred to serve quietly, in the background. But after much prayer and reflection, Sarah felt a new calling: to use her voice to help others who had been unjustly accused. Her first public speech took place at a small town hall meeting. Nervously clutching a well-worn Bible in her hands, Sarah stepped onto the stage, feeling the weight of hundreds of eyes on her. For a moment, she hesitated, unsure if she could find the words to convey all that had happened. But as she looked out at the faces of people hungry for hope and truth, she felt a deep calm wash over her. "I was condemned by man," she began, her voice steady. "But I was saved by God, and it is not because I'm special or worthy. It is because He is merciful. He does not abandon us, even when we walk through the valley of the shadow of death." Her words moved many to tears. She spoke not only of her own experiences, but of the inmates she had met in prison, women who had lost hope, who believed they were beyond redemption, but who had found comfort and strength in the prayers they shared with her. She urged the audience to see the humanity in those behind bars and to advocate for reform. As Sarah's story gained more attention, she was invited to speak at larger events. Churches, schools, and even legal organizations sought her out. Each time, she told the same story, not one of anger or bitterness, but of faith, forgiveness, and the transformative power of God's love. Her humility and sincerity resonated with audiences of all backgrounds, and many left her talks feeling inspired to make changes in their own lives. One of the most significant moments in Sarah's new journey came when she was invited to testify before a legislative committee on criminal justice reform. Standing in the austere chamber, surrounded by lawmakers and legal experts, Sarah felt a pang of nervousness. But she reminded herself that she was not speaking for her own sake. She was speaking for those who couldn't. When I sat in that cell, waiting to die for a crime I did not commit, I learned to rely fully on God, she told the committee. But I also realized that my case was not unique. There are others, many others, who do not have the support or the faith to carry them through. We must do better as a society to ensure that justice truly serves the innocent. Her testimony was met with standing ovations, and several legislators later credited her words as a driving force behind new policies aimed at preventing wrongful convictions. Though Sarah was becoming a public figure, she never lost touch with her roots. She returned to the prison where she had been held, not as an inmate, but as a visitor. She began leading Bible studies and prayer groups for the women she had once shared her cell block with. They welcomed her with open arms, seeing her as living proof that God had not forgotten them. One day, during one of these visits, Sarah had an unexpected encounter. Victor, the man who had framed her, had been moved to the same prison after his confession and conviction. When Sarah learned this, she requested to see him. The warden, aware of her story, reluctantly agreed. Sitting across from Victor in the sterile visitation room, Sarah saw a man who was a shadow of his former self. He looked gaunt, his eyes sunken with guilt and regret. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Victor broke the silence. "I don't even know where to begin," he said, his voice barely audible. "What I did to you, I can never make it right." Sarah's gaze softened. "You can't undo the past," she said gently, "but you can choose what you do with the future. I forgave you a long time ago, Victor, and God forgives you too, if you ask Him." Victor looked up, his eyes brimming with tears. "I don't deserve it," he whispered. "None of us do," Sarah replied. "That's the beauty of grace." They spoke for nearly an hour, and by the end of their conversation, Victor agreed to attend one of Sarah's Bible studies. Though his road to redemption would be long, Sarah left that day with a renewed sense of purpose. If even one soul could be brought closer to God through her story, then everything she had endured would have been worth it. In the years that followed, Sarah's work continued to grow. She founded an organization dedicated to helping the wrongfully accused, providing legal aid and spiritual support to those in need. Her testimony inspired countless others to examine their own faith, to forgive, and to trust in God's plan even when it seemed impossible. Sarah's life became a living testament to the words she'd spoken on the day of her near execution. "God is my refuge and my strength." Through her unwavering faith, her willingness to forgive, and her dedication to helping others, Sarah proved that even in the darkest of circumstances, God's light can shine through, bringing hope, healing, and redemption to all who seek it.